Well, we've seen how he's interested in black or white, and here's something that's literally nothing but black and white. It's actually a drawing, really, you could say. It's just line. Drawing made with paint. Well, we saw, it's not a surprise to us that he's interested in verticals and horizontals. We've seen that in his earlier works, how he's so interested in that. Now he's letting that be enough by itself to make an image. We don't need trees along a river bank or something like that. We just need verticals and horizontals. The formal elements are enough. So plus and minus. Here and ocean, the kind of titles that come up. So composition number 10, 1915, pier and ocean. I think we know this maybe is the pier here. There's a slight kind of vertical emphasis here. If we want to take a literal-minded approach to the title, I think he's discouraging that, by getting rid of obvious anecdotal subject matter. It's almost making it impossible for us to look at the image except in terms of shapes and colors. But if we do try and think about piers and ocean, well, maybe this would be the pier here, and that makes everything else the ocean, I suppose. If we are seeing an ocean, maybe we're looking down from above. Maybe it's more like a bird's eye view of an ocean. Remember, that's a kind of modern experience. It's only in the modern era that you could go up in a plane and look down on a landscape or a seascape, in this case, from above. It's part of our modern experience. Medieval people never had that, except maybe in dreams. But I don't know how they could dream it if they'd never seen it, or even in a film or something. This was done when he was back in Holland. He returned in 1914, the year the First World War broke out, and he ended up staying there because of the war. So yeah, at some level, yes, he's still engaging with natural motifs. On the other hand, it's a purely abstract work, you could say, but there's something of a natural motif. But it's not individual things in nature like one tree or something like that, as we've seen before, or one ginger jar. It's the whole ocean. Wow, that's not an easy thing to represent, right? How do you make a painting? Well, any painting of the surface of water, that's not an easy thing. Artists tended to avoid that. It wasn't their job particularly to tell you what the surface of an ocean looked like. They're more interested in showing you Jesus and Mary and the saints and what happened to them and the stories about heroes and blah blah blah, and making sure the space is clear that they're standing in, all that sort of thing. Maybe it's only when you get to artists like Monet that you see an artist really thinking, well, what actually does it look like, a surface of water, and how do you represent it properly so you have something adequate to your visual experience? But when Monet tried to do that, he found it's almost impossible. How can you? It's all constantly changing, breaking up, fluid. There's no solid form that sits there waiting for you to draw the outline of it. So it becomes a subject it's almost impossible to represent. Even if you use a film camera, a motion camera, or just a photographic camera, you find, I used a 60th of a second exposure, but already that waterfall is all kind of blurred in my exposure. It's not easy to, even with a camera, to capture it. So realistic strategies are at their very limits in relation to a subject like representing water, let alone a very large expanse like an ocean. So maybe abstract approaches are as good as any. Especially if that's what you're trying to emphasize anyway, is the kind of the openness or infinite quality of the ocean, not trying to capture a kind of sense of nature as neatly parceled up, but the reason you're representing the sea in the first place is you want to capture a sense of unboundedness of nature, God's nature as the face of God, if you like. Maybe you want to, you don't, but because you're Mondrian, you want that unboundedness, but you also want something to counterbalance it. This whole image is full of counterbalancing, verticals and horizontals, after all. So the pier is a man-made structure. Nature is unbounded, but a pier. Maybe we need piers as well. It's a way of getting into nature. It's a way of being in dialogue with nature. Some man-made structure. Well, the whole thing is structures and made by the man called Mondrian. So there's this sort of counterbalancing. When he was making more realistic paintings, he's interested in similar subjects. Nature, the ocean, its unboundedness, but also, structures that man has built to control or partially control the power of nature, the power of the ocean. Along the Dutch coastline, you'll see these things because in Zeeland, that area that we were talking about, very powerful wind and waves coming in. It would erode the shoreline. What we have here is a dike, a powerful kind of barrier that keeps the sea out. If the sea gets through that dike, it will flood the farmland. Actually, it will flood your homes as well. It's very dangerous because so much of Holland is very low-lying. So you need protection against the sea. Maybe people from some other country can feel very purely romantic about the wonderful power of the ocean and nature. But if you're Dutch, maybe you're a bit less going to think that way. You also want to think, but we need man-made controls of nature. So I see that as something that's coming in a work like this, a sense of balancing opposites. Structures and unboundedness as well. This motif of the ocean, it's helping him towards this more open kind of composition, which is different from this kind of more scaffolding kind of compositional structure that you get with Cubism. Already there's less sense of solid form, it's open in that sense, but the space in between, the forms don't kind of interlock so much. You can almost find your way through. Probably you could find your way through without getting blocked. There's enough breathing space. Yes, you can get all the way through. In the areas of white, you can't do that here. Nothing like that. So this is a more open paradigm for composition. It breathes, or it gives you a sense. What is it? The ocean is something alive. A painting has to be static, but how do you capture that sense of the movement, the constant aliveness of an ocean? I'm not telling you, Mondrian might say, about all the detail of each individual wave. Anyway, those waves are going to change from moment to moment. It's no use trying to capture them. But I can give you a sense of the movement of the ocean, maybe, through a visual equivalent to that, the sense of motion you get when you're looking at a work like this. It actually starts to come alive. It looks like it's made of something very simple, a few verticals and horizontals, but it actually starts to have a certain mobility to it. One part of that comes from just the simple thing of the different lengths of the lines. Since they're all vertical and horizontal lines of the same color, he's not got many different variables he can play with, but length of the lines is one. Towards the center of the image, there's a lot of longer lines. Well, compared to the here, well, what effect does that have? That has the effect of making you sort of trick your mind into thinking that these are closer somehow, that somehow all the lines are the same size and the smaller ones must be further away. The painting isn't actually saying that, but and he's just drawing lines as long as he wants to draw them, but it sort of feels like these are closer and that this is further away. As your eye moves around, you have a sort of slightly rippling sense of depth. So there's a three-dimensionality. Of course, there's a two-dimensionality as well. They're very much lines on a surface. There's something you can't quite see in this image because it's a little bit bleached out, and that is that there is white paint over the lines in certain points. So he's kind of complicated things in that way. If I showed you a different image of this painting, or if you were standing in front of the actual painting, you would see those brushworks that help to blur at the edge of edge of the forms. This is reproduced from the version that's authorized by the Mondrian Foundation. They control how his works are reproduced, and they want it to be reproduced like this, where it's you don't see those handmade marks, but actually in front of the painting you do see them, and I think Mondrian wanted you to see them. So there's a slight kind of falsification that can come up through representation like that. Maybe horizontals. I mean, the drama of composition is between bringing horizontals and verticals into harmony. The opposites come into some kind of unity. That's the drama of the painting somehow. Making a harmony out of opposites. Well, that could be symbolic. It's not just a compositional, visual, aesthetic problem. In life we have to harmonize differences and opposites, perhaps. So the painting therefore becomes a metaphor about such things. I think for Mondrian, definitely, he's thinking in that way. And he might even want you to think that this is the structure of the universe is structured on oppositions in dynamic harmony. In Chinese traditional philosophy, you have a notion of yin and yang in dynamic interaction. The whole of life is made up of opposites in dynamic interaction. Okay, this is a similar kind of idea. And he was influenced by certain sort of trends in Dutch mystical thinking or occult thinking. He was a member of the Dutch Theosophical Society, and he was influenced by someone called Schoenmakers, a writer who wrote these sort of occult and mystical things. And he talks about the importance of the cross. He says the figure which objectivates the conception of a pair of entities of the first order is that of absolute rectangular construction. The cross, very complicated language he's speaking there, but he's the cross, which of course in a Christian society has certain strong associations, is made of a vertical and a horizontal put together. I'll say a little bit more about that because this language comes even more so in his later works, but geometry coming to play a part. There's a kind of oval to the composition. we find oval forms in certain Cubist paintings, so it's something he could have got from them. I'll read you a few things that he says to give you an idea of his thinking, to give you the sense that it's not just about art, it's about spirituality or how we understand the universe. Here's Mondrian speaking. He says, observing the sea, the sky and the stars, well, in this case it's the sea, I sought to indicate their plastic functions with a multiplicity of crossing verticals and horizontals. Impressed with the vastness of nature, I was trying to express its expansion, rest and unity. When he talks about plastic function, I think you could say formal function. Here he is again. In the past, art was after nature. For centuries, painting pictorially expressed relations through natural form and colour, until it came in our own day to the plasticism of relations alone. For century painters composed by means of natural form and colour, at present the composition itself is the plastic expression, the image. So maybe plus and minus, vertical and horizontal, could be mind and matter, or male and female, yin and yang, as I say. It's a sort of process worldview, saying the world is made up of dynamic forces in some kind of balanced interaction that never comes to some static finish. You know, just as this painting, it has a certain kind of mobility to the composition. A more architectural structure like this wouldn't be an appropriate metaphor for that kind of way of viewing the world. Abstraction for Mondrian helps clarify the way the world is, because of its abstractness, like the abstractness of mathematics. It can lead you from this surface of life, which can confuse you, to give you a sense of what is underlying, what are the underlying patterns are. He's expressing this idea in his own words. He says, between the physical sphere and the eternal sphere, there is a frontier where our senses stop functioning. Nevertheless, the other penetrates the physical sphere and acts on it. Thus the spiritual penetrates the real. To approach the spiritual in art, one must make as little use as possible of reality, because reality is opposed to the spiritual. Thus the use of elementary forms is logically accounted for. Art should be above reality, otherwise it would have no value for man. You know, art is meant to lead you towards a kind of spiritual insight, if you like. It's not that different altogether from, say, a Renaissance painter inspired by Neoplatonist philosophy, feeling that when he represents Venus or something in a painting, he should represent her as more beautiful than any living human woman. You maybe take the eyebrows from one woman, the eyes from another, the lips from another, etc., and build a kind of purified image of beauty that could raise us towards a sense of the divine beauty, if you want. Very similar, of course. I just show you that that wasn't an isolated work. So this is, Composition with Lines, 1917. So that's images maybe from the sea, something like that. This is another kind of subject that interests him in this kind of borderline period, and that's building facades. Remember, I was showing you early on how he painted images of churches or of the lighthouse. You know, he's interested in the facade of buildings. Well, I think that's the same subject here. Looking at the structure of a man-made structure and it's all its verticals and horizontals. Maybe these are windows or something like that. Again, we've got this overall structure and this sort of blurring at the edges by overworking, which is clearer to see here. That helps to make the center of the image come out towards us. Introduces a kind of third dimension, but not a third dimension that is one you could illusionistically feel you could walk into, but it's one that's more just optically created, visually created. Well, he has many works like this, but maybe the lines are all too joined up. It's a bit too grid-like, gridlocked. You couldn't make a journey through. You get there's no breathing space there was in the other one we were looking at. So maybe ultimately this is not so fluid, not so useful a solution.
No, but I think that has something to do with what he is depicting. Like this is building facade and
yeah.
this is the sea.
Yeah. So it's appropriate, you're saying, for the subject. Yeah. But I'm also trying to think about looking ahead, what his mature style will be and which of these routes is going to be the most useful. Actually, he's taking a bit from everything is the answer. But no one subject is maybe entirely got all the answers. He wants to keep this mobility. Here's a little drawing he did, which actually we know was done from a church facade, a little drawing. Again, we have the oval structure. But we know how this kind of thing is coming from observing architecture. He's very interested in the man-made world, the city. But as I said before, even when he's treating nature, Dutch nature is often very man-made, very controlled anyway. It's a dialogue between man and nature. Vertical and horizontal, a dialogue of opposites. Or here, that grid-like structure is complete. It's just a checkerboard. It's just a chessboard. It's nothing but vertical and horizontals in a completely undynamic structure. But then he's brought colour back in as the way to activate it. Colour becomes what makes it breathe, what makes it dance, what makes it alive somehow. It's very optically active. In the 1960s, certain artists like Bridget Riley became very interested in these kind of optical effects, and we even hear of op art as a movement. But Mondrian is already there, So there's no individual objects anymore. It's all, it's the whole, a visual artistic whole. It's non-objective. Now he's just purely geometrical form. So he's starting from those forms rather than from something in nature. He doesn't need to go back to nature. Maybe he moves towards nature. Somehow natural associations can come in, but he doesn't need to start from nature. Activating the grid a bit more. But fairly soon, there are some transitional works like this, but fairly soon he arrives at a vocabulary that he stays with for the rest of his life, from the early 20s to around 1940, say. Something like that. A vocabulary of vertical and horizontal lines only, no diagonals, no curves, and the three primary colours, the colours that don't have any admixture of other colours at all, and white. Black and white, red, yellow, blue, vertical, horizontal, squares and oblongs only. Very, very reductive vocabulary, and then building up. Several artists have this feeling at this time, almost as if they want to find what is the basic linguistic structure. You could almost make an analogy to the way linguists were trying to work out what are the basic rules of language in more or less the same time period. Is there some rule that everything, or the diversity, surface diversity, can be explained by? So even from the teens, he's kind of focusing on this vocabulary. Well, that might sound a bit narrow, a bit boring, but actually it has advantages. One is, if you keep the rules of the game the same, then you might have more interesting games than if you keep changing the rules as you go along. Having a few simple rules doesn't mean that the game won't become complex. Like take chess, for example. The rule, knights can move in this way and castles move in that way. Just a few simple rules, but hey, chess could become very complicated if you apply those rules. Everything is very flat, there's no modeling, you could sort of look at it that the white is a background. Maybe we want to read white as background, but that doesn't sustain itself. The white is a color too, white is a form. At one level you might want to read the white as somehow behind the red, but also it's here on the flat surface as well. Something very funny, very interesting goes on, that you bring different preconceptions to your viewing. There's what you can see, and there's what you think. So you think that the white is further away, maybe behind, because you're used to white empty spaces being background. But there's nothing telling you that that is the case. Another thing that you kind of think is you kind of think that this line maybe continues off the edge of the painting, that actually this line is still here, but we can't see it. Something in our mind wants to think that, or think it's carrying on up there. Mondrian's not claiming that it's carrying on up there, but somehow our mind wants to imagine it. Or, is this a tiny yellow rectangle? Or is it that we're just seeing the corner of a much larger, maybe it's a square just like this. Maybe this is a square just like this. We don't have black lines around the edge to tell you that that's the boundary after all. Like we have come to that, we don't even know if we're seeing all of the red one, But one does, what one can see, obviously at some level this is the painting, but this painting is also kind of haunted by our sense of, things that might be outside, the lines continuing or the forms continuing. So visually that's a very complex phenomenon. We can see he's playing with different thicknesses of the black lines. This black line is clearly thicker than that one. It helps to balance the horizontal accents. He's still balancing horizontals and verticals. There's that binary, horizontal and vertical. But, the game is not so simple after all, because there's horizontals and verticals you've got to balance, but you've got to balance, that's a two-ness to balance, but there's also a three-ness to balance, and it's a different three-ness, the red, yellow, blue. Wow, this is getting hard to calculate. It's getting complicated. Different colors have different weights to them, you could say. Maybe a smaller weight of blue is powerful compared to a larger weight of red. Or anyway, colors move in different ways. Yellow often seems to come forward, blue seems to go back, so it helps to create a sense of space, even though we see no diagonals, to create a sense of recession towards our horizon. There's no vanishing point or anything, but maybe the colors themselves could help create a sense of space. They're not expressive colors. They're put in a fairly straightforward way. You're not aware of brushwork, although it is very handmade work. Very man-made. You know, it's balancing geometry and the handmade quality. How to create difference, but then to bring it together into unity. One way to go about this would be to try doing it yourself, try different combinations, or try start from an actual Mondrian painting. What would happen if you move this line up here, say? Move it right to the top, where it block the edge of the white. What would that be? Would that work? This is a little bit like how Mondrian himself worked. Actually, the lines come first. The lines are more central. He starts with his working method. He starts to stretch the canvas first onto a stretch or a frame, and he would play with strips of paper to represent the lines, try moving them around. Oh, maybe this is an influence from collage, but he never actually glues them on the surface as the cubists would. So there's a kind of structure of lines to begin with, and then he'll use a charcoal and a ruler maybe to put those lines into the painting. Charcoal where you could change it around, and then you paint the black lines. Then colour comes in as a secondary factor that complicates or maybe refines the balance. I suspect he already has some ideas about the colour before he finalises the line. Well, thinking about him in relation to the history of Dutch art, an artist like Vermeer is also very careful about organising the forms in his paintings, using the empty spaces, very strong sense of the empty space, exactly how big is this got to be and where is it going to be. It's not so different an idea altogether from what Mondrian is doing. Maybe he could find some hints from his own Dutch tradition. It's a Dutch religious tradition as well. Protestantism in Holland, Calvinism, often very austere, it wanting to a bit suspicious of images altogether, that they could distract you, and dancing and all these things, they could distract you. They're too sensual and distract you from your religious approach to life. Maybe that kind of cultural background is suitable for someone who's going to become a kind of iconoclast. An abstract artist is someone who's sort of got rid of images, just like someone who smashes images because he believes they're false idols. There's a sort of iconoclasm is part of, but it's a paradoxical iconoclasm that it's in the form of an image. This was photos taken by Cortez of Mondrian's studio when he was living in Paris. Very, very pure, simplified environment he was living in. The bit of nature is not nature, it's a man-made flower. So he's sort of abandoning inspiration from nature, turning inwards to create these works. Well, just to show you some other examples. We saw the composition in red, yellow and blue, 1930. This is composition with red, yellow and blue, 1927. The difference here is that it's more of a vertically orientated rectangular format. So that's something he can change. He could change the size or shape of the canvas itself. He's allowed to do that within his very simple rules. again, varying the thickness of the lines.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Is it because of the reproduction? But I think the bottom part of Y looks bluer.
Yeah, I don't. I think it's to do with the reproduction. Sorry.
Actually.
You mean it slightly here?
Yeah.
Yeah. Towards the beginning, then those sort of things happened a bit more. But where there's a certain a kind of grey quality.
Or probably because of the projector. Because before I saw images and usually the bottom.
Yeah, projectors will spoil. I mean, even the difference between how it looks on the screen and how it looks on the projector, there's some difference.
Yeah.
Let alone the fact that it's the scanning process will falsify, and maybe this was taken from a book and that was printer's ink. It's not actual oil paint, so we're already several stages away from the original. As art historians, we're reliant on reproductions. Artistry didn't begin until we had reproductions, really. But at the same time, we have to watch that it doesn't limit our approach. So always, whenever you have the chance to study from an original work of art, for example, during the Christie's and Sotheby's auctions, there's even then usually a small handful of European modernist artworks each time. Please make as much use of it as you can. Composition with yellow and blue, 1936. So from the 1920s to the 1930s, this is a very concentrated effort on staying with the same language, exploring the different possibilities. Each time you've shuffled the cards differently, it's going to come out a slightly different way. Here he's allowed himself to say, well, I don't even actually need, according to my rules, I can use up to 3 of the colours that have to be the primary colours, but I don't have to use all of them. Here he's just choosing to use 2. It's become more about the lines, less about the colour. The lines seem to dominate. So variations in thickness of the lines, little incidents like that become much more important because we're there's less to look at. Composition with red, yellow and blue, from 1937 to 42. This is towards the end of the period where he's using this limited format. We see, well, it's a little bit different the way he's using the blue here.
It's like a line.
Yeah, it's starting to become line-like, yeah. But that's, again, the sort of thing I'm talking about, just as we're imagining these lines continuing. It's like the frame is like cutting one little bit of something that could be almost infinite. Maybe these lines just go on forever and ever in all directions, and we just have a little bit of it that we're looking at. Same here, there's nothing telling you that this is a line. I mean, it could actually be, they're just 3 rectangles. Who says that they're a line? There's one,
But usually, like, if it's a square or it's a patch, usually you have a black line.
Yeah.
Side of it.
Yeah.
So that's why it looks like
Yes.
a line.
Well, yeah, except at the edge you're allowed.
Yeah.
The edge is a complicated thing, as well as the lines within the painting. There's the lines at the edge of the painting, which are very active, influencing the composition. And he's always allowed himself to be able to not frame the edge here.
Yeah.
But now he's allowing not to frame the edge on any side, So always colour has never been completely trapped by line, but here it's starting to get more sense of freedom. Maybe this freedom was in the rules all along, but it hasn't been used, you know. Somehow it's discovering possibilities. You're testing the limits of the rules you yourself have made. This is the Dutch landscape. Looking down on it, bulb fields in spring. It's a great tourist attraction to go to Holland if you can afford the time and money to do so, to go and see the Dutch bulb fields in bloom. So some people have said, oh yeah, well, you know, Mondrian's paintings, it's like a kind of Dutch landscape viewed from above, perhaps they even mentioned the bulb fields, and indeed there is something of that quality. But I think that's a bit too literal-minded a way of looking. You know, you'd spoil your understanding of the paintings if you looked at them in that literal-minded way. But maybe, since we've looked at earlier work and seen that it's a bit like a sea viewed from above, maybe it's a little bit like thinking of the Dutch landscape. I mean, the Dutch landscape is made up of all these linear elements of the canals, man-made or man-controlled rivers. You know, so verticals and horizontals have their equivalent in your everyday landscape of Holland. Wouldn't be altogether surprising if it did influence a little bit how people thought about their own landscape. A landscape when nature is constantly being kept in balance by man, that's the sort of the yin and yang of it, which is not there necessarily in all other landscapes. You know, even at one point in time they built this big dam across this inlet and created all this land below sea level, the great land below sea level. In Hong Kong we do that to create reservoirs, right? You know, Plover Cove Reservoir or High Island Reservoir created like that. But in Holland they do it to create land. So much of Holland is just below sea level, and it's only livable in and workable as agriculture because constantly the water is being pumped out, hence all the canals. Those windmills, mostly they're about pumping. There are a few that are about grinding grain to make flour or something like that, but most of them are about pumping water away. So the Dutch landscape is constantly a dynamic balance between man and nature. You know, that is at the level at which I think the Dutch landscape maybe influenced Mondrian, the sense of thinking of nature and control of nature together, so rather than just pure nature. So something has to be opposed by something else and kept in a dynamic harmony one with the other. That's the image of nature that's perhaps particularly to Holland. Okay, I think we have to stop there. So next week we'll look a little bit at the later work of Mondrian. Again, I've been taking my time with him as I did with Kandinsky. And then we'll go on to look at Russian abstract art. Well, Russian art during the revolutionary period, much of which is abstract.